Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Apocrypha Apocalypse. I'm Gary Machuda. In this episode, we're going to take a quick look at list. It's often assumed in apologetics that if an early church father composed a list of books, even Old Testament books, well, that must be a canonical list, which lists the exclusive set of books that were inspired by God. But is that so? And so in this episode, we're going to look at some questions that really should be asked whenever you encounter an ancient list so that you correctly understand and interpret it and not misrepresent it. So that's what we're going to look at today. So strap your seatbelts, folks, because the Apocrypha Apocalypse begins right now. All right. Well, the Protestant canon, the defense for the Protestant canon almost always invariably includes an appeal to ancient lists. In fact, sometimes it's just a list of people who made lists in antiquity. So it include members like Melito of Sardis, Origen of Alexandria, Hilary of Poitiers, Cyril of Jerusalem, the spurious canon at the Council of Laodicea, Athanasius, Gregory Nazianzus, Amphilochius, Epiphanius, and of course Jerome. That's almost invariably the list that will come up of people who wrote lists. And the assumption behind it is that if they comprise a list of books of the Old Testament, well, that must represent their own views of what is objectively the Old Testament canon. But is that necessarily the case? They obviously you can't just bring that assumption to bear on each and every individual. It's got to be worked through on a case by case basis. So, what I'd like to do is go through some questions that aren't asked by people who make such a defense. And these are very important because list can represent all sorts of different things. For example, if I have a list in my pocket of grocery items, that list could, and it usually does, represent the items I should pick up at the grocery store for my family. But that list can also be other things. It could be maybe items I should stay away from. Maybe the list was composed by my doctor and he's listing foods that I'm allergic to. So I shouldn't buy the books on that list. Or perhaps I made a list of grocery items that I want to pick up for somebody else, maybe for another family member or somebody outside my family, of food that they want, but I necessarily wouldn't want or purchase for myself. So a list by and of itself can mean many different things. And I think, unfortunately, when it comes to the defense of the Protestant canon, those questions aren't asked. It's just assumed that the early church father who gives a list is giving their own accepted, objective Old Testament canon, and it's closed and fixed. And that's not necessarily the case. So here's some questions that you ought to ask yourself when you're looking at ancient material. And these are questions, like I said, that simply aren't asked, even in academia. It's just assumed they're canonical lists. First thing is, what is the list meant to represent? Just like I used that grocery list, canonical list or list of books of the Bible, I should say, can represent things other than the canon. Let me put it another way. A list of books doesn't necessarily mean it's talking about the objective canon that that particular person who wrote it accepts any more than that grocery list. That list of grocery items necessarily represents the list that I personally want and that I'm going to purchase at a store. It could be lots of other things. It could represent all sorts of stuff. And that's very important, especially when it comes to the issue of the canon. Now, here's an example. Let's say I wrote a defense of Catholicism that is aimed at Protestant objections. And knowing that Protestants don't accept 7 Old Testament books that Catholics do, that we call the Deuterocanon and they call Apocrypha, I would want to instruct the Catholic who reads my book in which books are accepted by Protestants so that when they make a defense of Catholicism, they would know which books to appeal to. So let's say in this book I wrote, I would start with a list of the Old Testament books that are disputed between Catholics and Protestants, and thereby give a list of books that they accept. And of course, I accept too as a Catholic, but I don't accept only those books. Okay. Now, that list would be meant to represent another party, but it isn't what I believe is the objective, true canon of inspired scripture. I believe there's actually others and more that can be added to it, but it's meant to represent what they believe is inspired scripture for apologetic purposes. Now, let's say a couple hundred years from now, the only copy of my book that survives is the page that has my list. So you don't have the context. All you have is a few words and then the list and a few closing words. Would it be proper to say, well, this is a list of Old Testament books that Gary Machuda drew up? Therefore, those are the books that he accepted and none other. No, that would be erroneous, right? Because the context of my list shows that it's meant to represent something. And what it represents isn't my own view, but it's the view of others. And the same thing could be said with other views too. Like if you want to make a list of the Ethiopian canon, which is incredibly large, same thing. It doesn't matter. So that's the first and most important question that should be asked. When an author draws up a list of books, what is the list of books supposed to represent? Is it that of the author? Is it that of another party? Or both? Or something completely different? Okay. For example, you could have a list of, let's say, books that you feel is most certain to be inspired. Or you can have a list of Old Testament books that you think give the fullest history of a particular period, or things like that. So that's the most important question to ask. What is the list meant to represent? The second question you should ask too is this list descriptive or exhaustive? And lawyers understand this distinction because it's very important for contracts. If you have an exhaustive list, then that means anything that's not listed on that list is to be considered outside or rejected. An exhaustive list, for example, of a list of people who are to inherit in case of my death, as in a will. So I say, in case of my death, John so and so, Jean so and so, Billy so and so is entitled to 1/3 of everything I own. So that's exhaustive. So anyone who's not stipulated explicitly on the list does not stand to gain an inheritance. So that's an exhaustive list. You can have a descriptive list, on the other hand, where it's just giving a representation of things that perhaps are allowed or forbidden, but it's not exhaustive. In other words, there could be items that aren't mentioned, but and they would be assumed to be included in it as well. A great example of this is if you ever go to a live concert. At least they used to do this. They doesn't seem like they're doing it anymore. But there would always be an announcement about the things that are not permitted during the concert. And if you violate these, you'll be asked to leave. Like no flash photography, no audio recording, and so on and so forth. And they give 3 or 4 items and then they start the concert. But that's not the only thing on the list. For example, fighting. If you break out in a brawl, they will kick you out of the place, even though that wasn't stipulated on the list. Why? Because the announcement isn't there to give every single law and city ordinance and everything that you have to comply. I mean, some of those things are assumed, but it's meant just to give a sampling or description of maybe the most common things that are violated and people get thrown out for. So, if it's a no smoking venue, for example, and you go there and you light up a cigarette, you'll be kicked out, even though the announcement may not have announced that there's no smoking allowed. So that's very important. Is the list of scripture, is it meant to be descriptive, meaning that it just gives a certain amount of books for whatever reason, but not necessarily meaning to be exhaustive? Or is it exhaustive, meaning that whatever is not stipulated is rejected? Okay. Another question, too, is what is the author's purpose in composing the list? People often assume that any list of the Old Testament is an attempt to enumerate the Bibles of the Christian canon, but there are numerous reasons why that isn't true. A person could construct a list of books because they feel maybe they're the most significant, or there's a particular order they're interested in, or there's some sort of correspondence with numbers, or all sorts of things like that. And so the contents of the list actually is not as important as those other features. And with this question, I'm thinking of Origen of Alexandria and Hilary of Poitiers. This is a great example of someone who's composing a list that their purpose really has nothing to do with a canon, even though it has a list of books. For example, Origen is fascinated with the correspondence of letters and numbers and biblical books. So he tries to bring the 22 or 24 book, I forgot which one he does, his list of books in conformity with the particular number. And he does so actually by omitting the minor prophets. Same thing with Hilary Poitiers, who followed Origen. And so it's important to realize what is the purpose of the book. For example, the reason why Origen does it is he's from Alexandria. And as you well know, the school of Alexandria loved to get into not just literal, but symbolic meanings, ethical correspondences, things like that, typology. That's where it thrived. And that could be true not only with the contents of Scripture, but even the books of Scripture could take on some sort of mystical aspect to it. Another possible question that you should ask is this list meant to be objective or is it theoretical? Okay, objective or theoretical? In other words, is this list meant to represent the objective canon that is as it is? It's accepted by all, including the author, no speculation, nothing like that. Or is it theoretical? For example, an author may think to themselves, I don't think all the books read as scripture is helpful or sound. I think the church instead should only read these particular books. Okay. Or something like that. Is it theoretical or is it objective? Is there an element in which the author is giving their own opinion or ranking or something like that? Or is that author saying these are the books and only the books? Okay. So there's a standard that it recognizes. If it's objective, if it's theoretical, it's really their own personal reckoning of what is and what is according to whatever criteria they're using. Another question to ask is whether a list is meant for a particular group of people or a particular circumstance, or is it meant to be universally accepted? Okay. So a person could give a list of books that is to be universally accepted by all Christians at all times, everywhere. In other words, the objective canon. However, there could be pastoral needs in which, in a particular instance, a pastor may give special instructions to help the faithful in certain ways. So they might emphasize certain things and de emphasize other things simply because of the circumstances in which their flock lives. That's another very important question to ask. Of course, here I'm thinking of Cyril of Jerusalem, and there could be others as well, perhaps Gregory of Nazianzus. where it seems as if that they shape their list in a way so as to be most beneficial to their flock at that particular time. But they're not saying this is something all Christians ought to do and accept everywhere. Finally, does the terminology used in the ancient list, like canon, canonical, apocrypha, correspond to how it's being used today? This is huge, huge problem because sometimes in some early lists, they will say this is the list of the books of the canon, and we assume that what he means by canon is exactly what we mean by canon today. And the same thing's true with apocryphal and things like that. You can't assume this with works of antiquity. Why? For the simple reason that language changes with time. It's just the nature of the beast, folks, that a word may mean something in a particular period and change its meaning through time. So that's the list of questions that I want to give you, and hopefully you found this program helpful. So please subscribe, like, and if you enjoyed this, please subscribe, and we appreciate it. So until next time, I'm Gary Machuda. Take care. Bye-bye.